On the wall monitor outside the west corridor, one camera tile was still running, while every other feed in the palace had shifted to the scheduled security rotation. Senior Royal Guard Daniel Mercer stopped. The timestamp on that single feed lagged behind by exactly 43 seconds. Nothing in palace protocol allowed that delay, and the corridor on the screen was not empty. The security room was colder than the corridors outside, a steady mechanical chill that came from the ventilation system running without pause. Senior Royal Guard Daniel Mercer stood alone before the monitoring wall, the quiet broken only by the faint hum of equipment and the occasional soft tick of a cooling relay. The night rotation of camera feeds had just shifted to the scheduled pattern, a routine change that usually passed without notice, but one tile on the screen had not updated. Mercer's eyes settled on it almost by instinct. The timestamp in the corner lagged behind the others, not by minutes, but by exactly 43 seconds. Such a discrepancy was small enough to escape casual notice, yet precise enough to suggest a technical interference rather than a simple delay. He leaned closer, folding his arms, studying the image. The corridor displayed was the west inner passage, a narrow stone hallway reserved for staff transit during council hours, normally sealed to all but authorized movement. The lighting in the footage was dim, the lamps casting long amber shadows that stretched unevenly across the floor. At first, the corridor appeared empty, but then he noticed movement at the far end. A small figure stepped into view. The child moved slowly, not running, not playing, simply walking along the wall as if uncertain of where to go. Mercer felt a quiet tightening in his chest, not alarm yet, but an alertness sharpened by experience. Royal children were never permitted unescorted in that sector, particularly during council hours when access routes were deliberately restricted. He checked the log panel beside the monitors, scrolling through the last hour of movement clearances. There was no recorded authorization for a child or attendant to be in that corridor. The child paused near a side alcove, resting one hand against the stone, and stood there in stillness that felt too deliberate to be idle wandering. Mercer reached for the console to mark the irregularity, then hesitated. On the screen, two adults entered from opposite ends of the corridor. Their pace was brisk, purposeful. One wore the dark formal attire of administrative staff. The other appeared to be a security liaison, identifiable by the cut of the jacket and the badge clipped near the shoulder. They stopped several steps apart, their posture rigid. Even without sound, their gestures revealed tension, hands moving sharply, shoulders squared, one figure stepping forward, the other refusing to yield ground. The child remained near the alcove, watching without approaching, small and still in the half-shadow. Mercer's hand rested on the console, unmoving. A routine report would send the footage into the standard review queue, where it might sit until the next scheduled oversight check. That was the procedure, precise and structured, designed to prevent overreaction to minor anomalies. Yet the image on the screen did not feel minor. The silence in the security room seemed heavier now, the hum of the ventilation louder, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Mercer straightened slightly, eyes fixed on the monitor, aware of a quiet, growing sense that something in this corridor was unfolding without supervision, without record, and without the margin for delay that protocol assumed. Mercer replayed the segment from 30 seconds earlier, watching carefully for any sign that the child had been escorted or followed, but the corridor had been empty until the small figure entered alone. The lamps along the wall flickered faintly in the recording, a subtle fluctuation in voltage common in that wing, but tonight the irregular light seemed to exaggerate every movement, every pause. The two adults in the frame had drawn closer now, their gestures sharper. One pointed toward a sealed access door midway down the passage. The other shook her head, jaw set, arms folded tightly across the chest. Even without hearing their voices, Mercer could read the shape of disagreement, the contained hostility of people accustomed to authority but unwilling to concede it. The child shifted slightly, pressing back against the alcove, eyes fixed on the adults. Mercer felt the familiar internal calculation begin, the quiet weighing of time, risk, and responsibility that training never fully resolved. The correct procedure was clear: flag the irregularity, notify the duty officer, and allow the chain of reporting to proceed. That chain, however, moved at a measured pace, designed for accuracy rather than urgency. He checked the corridor access schedule again, confirming what he already knew. The west inner passage should be clear, sealed, and monitored continuously. A missing log entry, a delayed timestamp, and an unescorted child formed a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Mercer glanced toward the closed door of the security room, listening to the distant stillness of the palace at night. Somewhere above, beyond layers of stone and polished wood, the council meeting was in progress, drawing the attention of senior staff and security alike. Interruptions during such sessions were strongly discouraged, permitted only for immediate threats. Mercer reached for the console again, this time isolating the recording and securing a duplicate file to prevent automatic overwrite. The act was small, routine in itself, but it marked a decision forming, a shift from passive observation to deliberate preparation. On the monitor, the adults' confrontation continued, their movements sharp in the amber light, while the child remained near the wall, silent and alone in a corridor that should never have been occupied at all. Mercer replayed the segment from 30 seconds earlier, watching carefully for any sign that the child had been escorted or followed, but the corridor had been empty until the small figure entered alone. The lamps along the wall flickered faintly in the recording, a subtle fluctuation in voltage common in that wing, but tonight the irregular light seemed to exaggerate every movement, every pause. The two adults in the frame had drawn closer now, their gestures sharper. One pointed toward a sealed access door midway down the passage. The other shook her head, jaw set, arms folded tightly across the chest. Even without hearing their voices, Mercer could read the shape of disagreement, the contained hostility of people accustomed to authority but unwilling to concede it. The child shifted slightly, pressing back against the alcove, eyes fixed on the adults. Mercer felt the familiar internal calculation begin, the quiet weighing of time, risk, and responsibility that training never fully resolved. The correct procedure was clear: flag the irregularity, notify the duty officer, and allow the chain of reporting to proceed. That chain, however, moved at a measured pace, designed for accuracy rather than urgency. He checked the corridor access schedule again, confirming what he already knew. The west inner passage should be clear, sealed, and monitored continuously. A missing log entry, a delayed timestamp, and an unescorted child formed a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Mercer glanced toward the closed door of the security room, listening to the distant stillness of the palace at night. Somewhere above, beyond layers of stone and polished wood, the council meeting was in progress, drawing the attention of senior staff and security alike. Interruptions during such sessions were strongly discouraged, permitted only for immediate threats. Mercer reached for the console again, this time isolating the recording and securing a duplicate file to prevent automatic overwrite. The act was small, routine in itself, but it marked a decision forming, a shift from passive observation to deliberate preparation. On the monitor, the adults' confrontation continued, their movements sharp in the amber light, while the child remained near the wall, silent and alone in a corridor that should never have been occupied at all. Mercer secured the recording in the archive buffer and stepped away from the monitoring wall, the low mechanical hum of the security room suddenly feeling more oppressive than before. The air carried the faint metallic scent of conditioned ventilation, and somewhere behind the paneling a relay clicked, marking the passage of another minute. He moved to the secondary terminal and began cross-checking the access logs for the West Inner Passage, scrolling methodically through entries, clearance codes, and timestamps. The records were precise to the second, each movement accounted for by badge identification and automated door sensors, yet the 15-minute interval surrounding the footage showed only a blank line where a routine entry should have appeared. Not an error message, not a corrupted line, simply absence, as if that segment of time had been quietly erased. Mercer felt a subtle tightening along his shoulders. Missing entries were rare, and when they occurred, they were investigated immediately. But those investigations followed procedure, routing through administrative channels that could take hours before reaching operational command. He leaned back slightly, considering the structure of the reporting chain: duty officer, operations review, documentation verification, and only then escalation to senior command if warranted. Under ordinary circumstances, the system worked with deliberate efficiency. Tonight, the image of the child standing in the dim corridor remained fixed in his mind, silent and patient, unaware of how long administrative processes could take. He returned to the footage, watching again as the two adults faced each other, their movements rigid, their argument clearly escalating even without sound. The child shifted once, glancing toward the sealed door, then back to the adults, remaining close to the wall as if instinctively seeking distance. Mercer checked the time. The recording was now several minutes old, and the live feed from that corridor had already rotated out of primary view, replaced by other cameras as part of the scheduled cycle. He could restore it, of course, but doing so would register as an override, a small but noticeable deviation that required justification. The palace operated on layered accountability. Every action left a trace, every trace demanded explanation. Mercer rested his hands on the edge of the console, weighing the options with the same calm deliberation he had practiced throughout his career. Report quietly and allow the process to unfold, or intervene sooner, risking reprimand for bypassing established channels. The distinction between urgency and impatience was one every royal guard learned early, and the consequences of misjudging it could be severe. Yet as he watched the final seconds of the recording, seeing the adults step closer together, their gestures sharper, the child shrinking further into the alcove, he felt the quiet certainty that delay carried its own form of risk. Mercer rose from the terminal and walked the length of the security room once, slowly, the polished floor absorbing the sound of his steps. Through the reinforced glass panel at the far end, he could see the outer corridor, empty and still, lit by the soft amber fixtures used during evening operations. The palace at this hour moved in subdued rhythms, distant footsteps, muted voices behind closed doors, the faint vibration of elevators rising and descending far beyond the stone walls. Everything suggested order, continuity, control. Yet the absence in the log file and the tension in the recorded corridor formed a quiet contradiction to that order, one that could not be reconciled by routine paperwork alone. Mercer returned to the console and restored the West Inner Passage feed to active monitoring, watching the live image resolve into focus. The corridor was empty now. The lamps burned steadily, the sealed door remained closed, and no figures were visible. Whatever confrontation had occurred had already dispersed, leaving only the silent architecture and the faint flicker of electric light. Mercer felt no relief at the emptiness, only a deeper unease, because absence meant the moment for immediate observation had passed. Now the matter depended entirely on response time. He accessed the internal directory and located the council chamber schedule. The meeting in progress was classified as high priority, attended by senior officials and members of the royal household, including Prince William. Interruptions were restricted to confirmed security threats or incidents posing immediate danger. A delayed recording of a confrontation, however troubling, did not fit neatly within those definitions.
Mercer stood motionless for several seconds, aware that the decision before him would not be evaluated by the clarity of hindsight, but by the narrow boundaries of regulation. He imagined the report filed through standard channels, the footage reviewed hours later, the questions asked too late to alter what had already happened. Then he recalled the child's posture in the alcove, the stillness of someone waiting without understanding what was unfolding around them. That image carried more weight than any written directive. Mercer copied the recording onto a secure drive, sealed it in a slim evidence sleeve, and signed the digital log acknowledging personal custody, an action that formally removed the material from routine circulation and placed responsibility entirely on him. The quiet certainty of the choice settled in as he straightened his jacket and moved toward the door. The council chamber lay 2 corridors away and 1 level above, guarded not only by protocol but by expectation, and Mercer knew that crossing that threshold uninvited would draw immediate scrutiny. Still, he stepped into the corridor, the cool air of the palace brushing against his face, and began walking toward the staircase, aware that with each measured step he was moving beyond procedure and into judgment.
The staircase leading to the council level was quieter than the lower corridors, the thick carpeting absorbing Mercer's footsteps until even he could barely hear them. Wall lamps cast a steady, warm light across framed portraits and polished railings, and the air carried the faint scent of waxed wood and distant fireplace smoke from the reception rooms further down the wing. Mercer kept his pace measured, neither hurried nor slow, maintaining the controlled bearing expected of a senior guard. Yet beneath that discipline, he could feel the steady pressure of time. The evidence sleeve rested flat against his palm, its slight weight but insistent, a reminder of the responsibility he had chosen to carry personally rather than disperse through routine channels. At the top of the stairs, 2 guards stood outside the council chamber doors, positioned with the rigid stillness of ceremonial duty, but alert to every movement in the corridor. Both recognized Mercer immediately. One inclined his head slightly, acknowledging rank without speaking. Mercer returned the gesture and requested entry in a low, even voice, stating that he carried security material requiring immediate review due to a potential breach involving a restricted corridor and the presence of a minor. He kept his voice steady and concise, offering no speculation, only verifiable facts. The room grew quieter as the meaning of his words settled over those present. Prince William studied Mercer for a moment, then accepted the recording and instructed that the display monitor be activated. The lights dimmed slightly as the footage appeared on the screen, and the corridor scene unfolded in silence before the assembled officials. Mercer stood near the wall, hands clasped behind his back, watching not the screen but the reactions in the room. At first, there was only concentration, the restrained attention of people accustomed to reviewing reports and briefings, but as the image of the child standing alone became clear, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Chairs stilled, pens ceased moving, and several officials leaned forward slightly, their focus sharpening. When the 2 adults entered the frame and their confrontation began, the change in the room deepened. No one spoke, yet the tension in the footage seemed to carry into the chamber itself, settling like a weight in the warm air. Prince William raised a hand quietly, and the playback was paused at the moment the adults stood closest, their gestures sharp, the child visible in the background near the alcove. He asked a single question, directed not to Mercer alone, but to the room, whether this incident had been logged through the standard reporting chain. Mercer answered truthfully that it had not yet entered routine processing, explaining that the recording had revealed a missing log entry and that he had judged the circumstances to require immediate review due to the child's presence and the absence of supervision. There was no challenge in the silence that followed, only consideration. Prince William nodded once, then instructed that the meeting be suspended and that the individuals visible in the recording be identified and located without delay.
The order was given calmly, without raised voice or visible frustration, yet the effect was immediate. Staff members rose, documents were gathered, and a quiet but purposeful movement replaced the earlier stillness. Communication officers stepped into the corridor to relay instructions to security teams, and the large chamber, moments earlier absorbed in policy debate, transformed into a center of coordinated response. Mercer remained where he stood until one of the senior security officials approached him, requesting details about the origin of the footage and the timeline of discovery. He provided the information succinctly, careful to remain within the boundaries of fact. Even as he spoke, he could feel the subtle shift in perception around him, not hostility, but the awareness that his decision to bypass routine channels had altered the course of the evening's proceedings. When the playback resumed briefly to capture still images for identification, Mercer saw again the small figure of the child in the alcove, silent and motionless amid the adult's dispute, and the quiet certainty returned that the interruption had been necessary. Beyond the chamber doors, footsteps moved quickly along the corridor as search teams dispersed, and the palace, so carefully ordered only minutes before, began to adjust to the consequences of a single irregularity that had refused to remain unnoticed.
The review room was smaller than the council chamber, built for precision rather than ceremony. A long table faced a wall-mounted display, and the lighting was cooler, designed to reduce glare and sharpen detail on screens. Mercer stood at the rear of the room as the footage was prepared for detailed examination. Two technical officers worked quietly at the console, isolating frames, enhancing contrast, and synchronizing the recording with access control data. The atmosphere was subdued, not tense in the dramatic sense, but focused, the kind of concentration that settled over professionals who understood that small details often carried the greatest consequences. The first sequence played again, slower this time. The child appeared at the far end of the corridor, walking with measured steps, one hand trailing along the stone as if following the texture for reassurance. Mercer noticed details he had not fully registered before. The way the child paused near the alcove and glanced back down the passage, the slight hesitation in posture that suggested uncertainty rather than curiosity. There was no attendant, no visible escort, and no sign of anyone guiding the child's movement. The recording advanced to the moment the first adult entered from the eastern end. Identification software overlaid a name and departmental affiliation on the screen, a senior administrative coordinator with clearance privileges limited to scheduled access windows. Moments later, the second adult appeared, identified as a liaison officer attached to infrastructure planning, authorized for the corridor only under specific supervision. Both had legitimate roles within the palace structure, neither known for disciplinary issues. That fact alone deepened the unease in the room, because it suggested the situation had not arisen from obvious misconduct, but from decisions made under the assumption of authority. The confrontation unfolded frame by frame. One of the officers pointed repeatedly toward the sealed access door, gesturing in a manner that indicated urgency or frustration. The other responded with a sharp shake of the head, arms crossing defensively, then uncrossing to emphasize a rebuttal. Without audio, their words were unknowable, yet their movements conveyed a clear struggle over permission, over who had the right to proceed. The child remained near the alcove, shifting slightly but never leaving the wall, eyes following the adults with quiet vigilance. Mercer felt the familiar weight of observation settle over him, the responsibility of witnessing something that could not be altered, only understood and acted upon afterward. The playback paused as one of the technical officers isolated the door control panel visible behind the adults. Access lights on the panel flickered during the argument, indicating multiple attempted overrides.
Each attempt would have generated a system alert, yet no such alert had been recorded in the main log, confirming that the 15-minute gap in entries had coincided precisely with the attempted access. The absence was no longer merely suspicious, it was deliberate. The review continued with additional camera angles reconstructed from adjacent corridors, forming a partial timeline of events before and after the confrontation. One sequence showed the child entering the restricted passage through a service door that had been left temporarily unsecured during equipment transport earlier in the evening. The door should have been relocked immediately after use, but the latch sensor revealed a delay of nearly 4 minutes before full closure, a window long enough for a child wandering nearby to slip through unnoticed. Another camera captured the administrative coordinator approaching the sealed access door from the opposite direction, evidently focused on reaching the restricted area rather than surveying the corridor ahead. The liaison officer arrived moments later, and their exchange began almost immediately, attention fixed entirely on the disputed entry point. At no moment in either angle did either adult acknowledge the child's presence. The realization settled heavily in the room. It was not malice that had placed the child at risk, but distraction, combined with the quiet presumption that authority granted freedom to focus on one's own objective. Mercer watched the sequence again, this time noting the subtle physical cues, the way both adults leaned toward the control panel, their backs partially turned to the corridor, the narrow field of attention that excluded everything beyond the immediate conflict. A senior security analyst spoke softly, observing that the attempted overrides suggested both individuals believed they possessed sufficient clearance, yet neither had followed the required authorization path. It was a misuse of authority not born of defiance, but of assumption, a belief that procedural barriers were obstacles rather than safeguards. The playback reached its final frames, showing the argument ending abruptly as both adults received communications on their handheld devices, likely summoning them elsewhere. They departed in opposite directions, leaving the corridor empty except for the child, who remained near the alcove for several seconds before slowly retracing steps toward the service door. Mercer felt a faint chill despite the controlled temperature of the room. The most dangerous moments, he reflected, were often the quietest ones, when no one realized that harm had nearly occurred. The technical officers compiled a preliminary report, noting the missing log entries, the attempted overrides, and the unsecured service door as converging failures rather than isolated errors. Recommendations began to form: system audits, revised supervision procedures, stricter logging enforcement. But Mercer's thoughts lingered on the image of the child walking alone in the dim corridor, unaware of how narrowly vulnerability had passed into danger. Outside the review room, footsteps moved in the corridor as security teams continued their inquiries, and the palace carried on in its measured rhythm. Yet the understanding in that small room had shifted. What the footage revealed was not merely an incident, but a pattern, a quiet warning that authority, when exercised without attention, could create risks no one intended, but everyone was responsible to prevent.
The internal inquiry convened 2 days later in a chamber far removed from the ceremonial halls, a room designed for review rather than deliberation. Its walls were plain, its lighting neutral, and its long table marked only by folders, digital tablets, and the subdued presence of those called to examine events without distraction. Mercer sat at one end, posture straight, hands resting calmly before him, while the inquiry panel reviewed the compiled material, footage transcripts, access logs, technical reports, and written statements from the individuals involved in the corridor incident. The atmosphere was not accusatory, but it carried the gravity of careful judgment, the kind that came from people aware that small precedents could shape future conduct across the entire palace security structure. A senior investigator began by outlining the timeline in measured detail, speaking in a steady voice that carried clearly through the quiet room. The unsecured service door, the missing log entries, the attempted override of access permissions, and the presence of the child in a restricted corridor were each examined in sequence, not as isolated mistakes, but as connected failures. Mercer listened without interruption, aware that his own decision formed part of that chain. When asked to describe the moment he chose to bypass routine reporting, he answered simply, explaining the delay inherent in standard channels and the concern raised by the child's presence. He did not justify or defend the decision. He stated only the circumstances and the reasoning as he had experienced them. The panel members exchanged brief glances, noting his account, then turned to the testimony of the administrative coordinator and the liaison officer. Both acknowledged attempting to access the restricted door without proper authorization, each describing the pressure of deadlines and the assumption that their roles granted them flexibility. Neither had seen the child until later, when informed of the review. Their statements were calm, subdued, marked by the restrained discomfort of professionals confronting the consequences of inattention rather than deliberate wrongdoing. As the inquiry progressed, technical officers presented findings from the system audit. The missing log entries were traced to a temporary software override initiated during maintenance earlier that evening, a safeguard intended to prevent false alarms while equipment was calibrated. The override had been left active longer than intended, creating a silent interval in which alerts and access attempts were not recorded in the primary system. The explanation clarified the mechanism, but did not lessen the seriousness of the lapse. Mercer felt a quiet awareness settle over him that the incident had not been the result of a single failure, but of multiple small oversights aligning at the same moment, each harmless in isolation, together forming a vulnerability. The final phase of the inquiry focused on conclusions and recommendations. The panel's findings were delivered without ceremony, their tone steady and precise. The misuse of authority by the two officials was formally recorded, not as misconduct born of malice, but as a breach of procedural discipline that carried measurable risk. Revised training and stricter access enforcement were ordered, along with immediate changes to maintenance protocols to ensure that system overrides could not remain active without supervisory confirmation. Additional measures addressed child protection procedures within residential and administrative wings, including mandatory escort verification and improved monitoring of transitional spaces, such as service corridors. Mercer listened as these decisions were recorded, aware that each reform carried the quiet imprint of the event he had witnessed. When the panel addressed his own actions, the room grew slightly more still. The senior investigator acknowledged that bypassing the routine reporting chain had technically violated established procedure, yet the same statement recognized that the decision had accelerated the response and brought the incident to immediate attention at a level where corrective action could be taken without delay. The conclusion was delivered in measured language. Mercer's judgment had been reasonable under the circumstances, and no disciplinary action would be taken. The words were neither praise nor absolution, merely an acknowledgment of balance between rule and responsibility. The inquiry adjourned shortly afterward. Mercer stepped into the corridor outside, where the air felt cooler and carried the faint echo of distant footsteps moving through the vast structure of the palace. For a moment he remained still, adjusting his gloves, listening to the quiet rhythms of a building returning to normal routine. Nothing outward had changed. Guards still stood their posts, staff moved through the halls, and the steady machinery of administration continued without pause. Yet Mercer felt the subtle weight of the past days settle into memory,
a reminder that vigilance was not only a matter of standing watch, but of recognizing the moments when rules alone could not account for human vulnerability. Later that evening, he resumed his post in the monitoring room, the familiar glow of screens reflecting softly across the walls. Cameras displayed corridors, stairwells, and quiet rooms, each image calm, ordered, eventless. Mercer watched them with the same steady attention as before, aware that most nights would pass without incident, and that as it should be. But he also understood, with a clarity shaped by experience, that the duty of a royal guard was not measured only by adherence to protocol, but by the willingness to act when the safety of the vulnerable depended on judgment rather than instruction.